Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Leap. As always, I am deeply grateful for those of you who are tuning in and hope that today's conversation is helpful to anyone who might need a dose of hope. Today, my guest is Nancy Owen Nelson, and Nancy has numerous books and essays that she has published over the years, and we will have that in her bio for you. Her most recent book is called Divine Aphasia, A Woman's Search for Her Father. Nancy has been a long-term English professor and taught for over 51 years. And so it is a deep pleasure to have you with us here today. Nancy, we are going to be talking about a few losses that she had. Two of the most tragic are a husband that she lost last year of close to 25 years of marriage, and her father when she was 23 years old. And so I want to welcome you to the show today, Nancy. Thank you for being here.
I'm so very happy that you've been receptive to having me, and I thank you for your work.
Thank you. So let's go ahead and why don't we start with the loss of your dad, because you were so young. And I know that the loss of your father really was the impetus to a lot of your written work as well. So can we start with your dad and just talk to us a little bit about him and what happened with your father?
Okay, he was a 30-year Army man, very committed, rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel, was head of battalions in various places, and then began to drink. My sisters were a good bit younger than myself, but so we had almost like two different families because by the time I was 4, one of them had left. So essentially, I didn't experience what they did, but there were scars from that journey that he was on of depression and maybe a sense of being a black sheep. He was a very good man. He actually taught Sunday school and was a lay preacher and gave to people and wanted to do the right thing, but he was troubled. So when I was at college, in my college career, he suffered an aneurysm, and he had not been drinking very much, but he died in '68, right during my final exams for spring semester, spring quarter. So all those years, I trace his decline, physical decline, and his depression and so forth, but also try to explore what I remember that was really good and wonderful about him. So I was young. My mother was devastated. They were just one day short of 40 years, had raised 2 daughters and had 3 grandchildren at that point.
How did losing your father at such a young age impact you?
I think actually I knew he was leaving. You can feel when people decline. And I had married very young the first time at 19, just barely 20. I think in part to find a way, to find somebody, to find what I was supposed to be doing. I was a sophomore, just out of between sophomore years. So he died 2 years later. It was a terrible loss. And for a long time I was angry at the fact that he had been drinking so much and there had been so much talk in our family. My sisters and my mother would try to figure out what to do. And in their era, there was no remedy for this, but I think I carried it with me in a way that I was not aware of. And I was only to discover years later that I was always looking for him again in other relationships. And I didn't find him, and I didn't find him.
And that's such an important part of your story, because what people don't know, and I think that that's probably at the heart of at what we're going to be talking about today, because you ended up marrying 5 times, and 2 of those husbands ended up taking their own life. And I know we're not going to get into that, but I think it's important for listeners to understand where, the losing your father at such a young age, that impact that it had, it was a lasting impact over those years. And I think what you just said is really important. I think there's still so much stigma around grief and loss and people having an outlet to talk about it. I mean, I hear all the time still that people feel like there is some sort of expiration date on being able to talk about that loss. But back then, you really didn't talk about it. I mean, you had a mother that, you had a mom that lost her husband at a very early age. You were in college. And where does all of this grief go? You probably, I mean, at that point, did you feel like you were taking on this burden of having to take care of your mother? What was happening? What was that dynamic between you and your siblings and your mom after your father died? And also, was your father the primary breadwinner? Did your mother have a job at that point? Like, what were those dynamics like?
Well, my father had retired after 30 years. And one thing I didn't mention is that he was demoted, and the excuse given was, and this is part of the grief too, I think, because I watched it and I recorded it in the book. He was given the fact that somebody lost his reenlistment papers. So he was willing to come back and reenlist as a master sergeant after having been a lieutenant colonel. So there was that. And then he went to Korea, and those times were difficult for separation of families. When he did pass, my mother was not allowed to teach. She was teaching when they met, and in 1927 in the South, women could not teach if they were married, really old there. So I always saw her as a continuing teacher. She loved literature, poetry she wrote. She impacted me. So she pulled her life together, and she had a little pension from him, and she didn't work. So that the dynamic was that she filled her life up with people, young people, writing, her church work. And I'm still in touch with some of the young people who are now mature adults. So that legacy lives on. She gave me a model for how to go on, but she never married again, and she didn't want to take care of anybody else. So she just remained herself, single. Yeah, her mother had died in childbirth, so I didn't realize she was carrying that with her all the time too. So.
Yeah, it's incredible, isn't it? When we deal with some losses, when we get a little hindsight, we understand how grief impacts us throughout our lifetime, especially, your mother didn't go to a therapist then, right? I mean, that's not how we dealt with grief. And still today, there's plenty of people that walk around with their grief and not knowing exactly what to do with it. Because I also think that when we're grieving, we're sad. We don't necessarily need to pathologize it, but I do think we need to be able to talk about it. And if we don't, where does that grief go? Sometimes it comes out as anger. Sometimes it comes out as depression. Sometimes it comes out as anxiety. And what I heard from you is that at that young age of losing your dad, that you spent the next several decades searching for that father figure, right? And you did so through marrying these men that weren't quite right. So you married them, and you left, and you got divorced. So talk to us about this man that you married, that you spent the last 25 years of your life with, because this man died last year. And so please talk to us about your partner.
I look at it as a miracle that we met. We were very different. He was some years older, eight years older than myself. And somehow after the fourth one and the resolving of that difficult ending, and that was one of the ones who later took his own life, I was pledged to go on alone. I'm not going to do this again. And then he was too. And we met each other, and it was like putting on a fitted glove. And no marriages are easy, but I've never had anything as easy as that was. My metaphor is we were walking our own ways, and we met and turned and walked together. We never took each other over. I was totally myself with him, and he was totally himself with me. We had to work through things, obviously, in the early years, but there was never a sign of losing the core of that. He was kind. He was quiet to my chatter, and solid. And after he went, people in the literary community said he was always there with this kindest look on his face and the interest. He would take interest in people. He loved my mother. He took her for walks in the woods. He painted her fingernails. When I was teaching, he would go to the nursing home and paint her fingernails and take her in. He didn't have any kind of big macho thing going on with himself. He was totally self-grounded, and he gave me stability. And so the tough thing about losing him is turning around and seeing I've got to do all this alone. I've got to think it through alone, because he took care of much more than I ever realized.
And this was a very sudden loss for you as well, right? I mean, this was something totally unexpected.
You know, from being struck with the brain bleed to dying about 14 days later. And he could have gone sooner, but I kept thinking I wanted to get the report so I want to understand what's possible. And then when I saw the writing on the wall, I had to let it go.
Can you talk to us? I mean, just so that we all understand a brain bleed, because I told you I used to work in brain injury, and I understand a brain bleed. But for those who don't, how did you know? Was he confused? Like, how did you know something was happening?
I went upstairs. We have a big house. I went upstairs to take a nap, have a counseling session, and talk to a friend on Zoom. So I was up there a couple hours, and he said he had a headache. I came down, and he was sitting in his chair. His glasses were half off, and he could not move, and his mouth, the way you get with the stroke, was
It was an aneurysm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it was terrible. He could not walk. They were trying to help him walk when they got him up. So that's how I knew. And he had many little strokes, one or two. So I knew the signs, but this was totally like everything. I mean, he could say one word, and that was a medication that he was on. They asked him, I can't even remember now, I'm blocking, because that happens with me, I block out. And they took him to the hospital, and that's the last time he was even alert enough to say anything.
I was going to say, because what happened is did he slip into a coma at some point?
Yeah, I think they put him in one, and then they couldn't get him out.
So talk to us about what this past year has looked like for you. With divine aphasia, did you write that? You wrote that prior to your husband's death. And so talk to us what this past year has looked like for you after losing your husband.
Getting up in the morning, especially at the beginning, I had to ask myself, what am I going to do? Where do I turn? I began to experience memory issues, which I now know are part of the trauma, dizziness, some vertigo. I lost 20 pounds. I pulled back from obviously I didn't want to do anything, because it's like you're going in a constant circle of grief and trying to figure out why to get up the next day and what to do next. If I had not had a counselor and friends, I probably couldn't have gotten through this. They're still there for me. So it was so devastating that I felt like I wish I had just gone ahead with him. I took a blood test a few months later, and she said, everything is all over the place here. Everything, oxygen and, blood sugar, everything was skewed. And she said, I'm not surprised. She wasn't too alarmed, because this is what happens, I think, with people when they have tremendous trauma. Memory is still bothering me. I mean, today I'll tell the joke that I thought, what time was it? Like 6 hours ago. So, I got that mixed up. I forget appointments, but I'm doing better. It's taken a while. I'm doing better, trying to be productive and look forward. But sometimes I ask myself, why am I leaving him, Roger? Am I leaving him by going forward? And there's the guilt pull too. So there's that. But I tried to talk to him. You and I didn't discuss this, but I got, with the cremains, I was able to get hearting stones. I don't know if you know about them.
Talk about them.
I brought one in here. This is Roger. And they took half of him, and I had them made into memory stones. They're called parting stones. And I gave them to very special people whom I knew valued him. Only those who would take it well. And I touch them off and on all day long, because I'm talking to him.
So let's talk about that. You're talking about his ashes.
Yeah.
And they're in a stone. Yes.
Right.
And I don't know can you talk to us about, because I know there's jewelry that can be made from ashes. Mm-hmm. Some people may or may not know this. Where did you get the memory stones made? Because we'll put this in the show notes as well. Did you go through, was it through a company you found online? Did you have to mail the ashes in? How did you have that made?
The funeral home offered the option, and I can find the site, but it's just something like parting stones. I think they're out west.
Yeah.
And send them to you, and then they ask you to write a handmade note back to the people who create them, because they want to know what they meant to you, so they can, foster that ongoing sense of having the person with you without being too strange about it.
I think it's beautiful. I think it's amazing.
Yeah, very
that
fortunate.
that these things exist. So I love that you talk to him. Everybody has different beliefs about the afterlife. Has your feelings or beliefs changed since the death of your husband?
Absolutely.
How? Talk to us how.
Well, I started noticing feelings and things. I did some exploration of appearances after and feelings that people have about seeing someone. And I haven't seen him, but I have felt him in my presence in this house. And I also had a dear friend in Arizona who is now in Hawaii, who was I guess she's a medium, and she knew Roger, and we had a phone session, and she said that she connected with them, and there were some things on there that really no one else could have known. So I feel good about it. If he can't be here in the other way, at least he's hanging out this way.
Did you have that belief system prior to his death, or is this something new? Because that sensing that there's something that you can't touch, but you can feel is so palpable that you just can't deny it. Like what happened?
I think it was lurking around the edges of my consciousness, but I never, took time. I didn't, I was busy. I mean, I was raising a son, I was teaching, etc. So I didn't do anything with it. But when he was gone, it's quiet, and then you feel things and you think you see things. And part of it, people could call whatever they want to call it. But I did start doing some reading. I'm reading very slowly the Tibetan book of the living and dying, and there's a lot in there about the bardo and the levels of transition. And I felt some comfort in that. The person I counsel with is open to these things and supports what I'm trying to say, when I tell them, and believes me. He's not thinking I've lost my mind. And there's other things I've done. I just, it's interesting that I tell people, and they're older people, he's here and I'm talking to them, and they don't look at me funny, because I think more people than not really do have this experience.
I agree. And I think there's also this misnomer that those of us who believe, because I talk to my brother and my mother all the time too, and that for those of us who do believe in something bigger, that our energy, our soul lives on, that somehow that helps to shorten the grieving process. And what I say is, it brings me comfort, but it doesn't take away the sense of loss or missing that tangible person that you can hug and touch and feel and talk to. I miss my mom so much, and I would tell my mother everything. And she definitely was my best friend, and she was aphasic, like, because she had had a stroke as well. And I went to a medium, and she said, your mother can really feel, she knows how much you miss her, and she just wants you to know that she's around you, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, I know that. Of course, I believe that. I know that. But I still miss looking at my mother and talking to her and hugging her, and how her hug alone, she never needed to speak. Her presence was such a deep support. And so I always say this on the podcast, that you can have both. You can have that sense that they're around us, and you can miss them like crazy at the same time. I mean, something that you had mentioned to me before I started recording is that you have the waves of grief where you'll cry and miss, and deeply miss that physical presence of your spouse. And I think something else that you said I want to talk about is that feeling of getting up and wanting to go on, like, why am I still here? etc. And I think that's also true as we age, like with my dad, who has lost my mother of, I don't know, 50 some odd years. Yeah, 52 years or something, or 53 years. I don't know. I've lost track. But when you've had a partner for when you're growing old together and you know that somebody is going to go first, but I think navigating that is it's a different kind of loss when you lose this life partner and you've retired from your work and you're at that latter stage of your life and what that feels like. I think that that is a different loss, and my dad and I have talked about this. But I would love you to give that language, that now you're not that busy. You are still busy because you're very engaged in life and you write and you're doing all of these things and you have retired from your professional career as a professor. But can you talk to us about that? Am I making sense? I don't even know if I'm asking the question.
Yeah, you are, because it's a big question. Who am I now?
Yeah.
Oh, I've been, since I started thinking about it for decades, I've been a feminist, and I thought, I kept my maiden name and I insist upon it, et cetera. Not that goes back to men too, but so I've got that. And so, but you still are impacted when you're with a person for that long and the person is your best friend and you would tell that person anything, everything, the bad, the good, and you could be mad at them and make up or whatever. And then that person is not there. It's like somebody, and this may be cliche, like they took part of my body off. And even in the early days, walking across a room was disorienting. Why am I going in here? What am I trying to do? What is the point of doing this? It was the ultimate feeling of being lost. And in fact, you mentioned the divine aphasia, which goes back to an existential play by Beckett. And I had that feeling in that play when I taught it, but I never really felt it in my body the way that I do now. I understood it intellectually that there's no answers, and you try to understand, and it's funny, and etc. But now there's no answer. The only answer is for me to say that I am worth going forward as me, because part of that is what's left, and why should I bother? Even though I have a lot of irons in it.
Yes.
And then there's ageism, in our culture, which I fight against too. I think we need to not put people in boxes. And it's important. It's important to be able to feel like you can walk beyond that. But how? Your body, your whole body, your body is impacted. Your mind is impacted. Your balance, everything for me.
Every cell in our body. You talked about how it impacted memory. It impacts every single thing in our life in different ways. The analogy I used as of late is trying to describe grief, and the way it impacts us is like trying to, when you stick your finger in a pool trying to point out water to somebody, right? You can't, because it's pervasive, it's everything, it's everywhere. You're looking out your eyes and it changes the landscape of your world, what you see, the way you see it, and how you experience it.
That's really well stated. Yes.
And the way that we think about grief is, I always say it's the thief of our joy, right? It steals our joy. And I think that healing process is, how do we reclaim that joy? How do we allow ourselves to feel that joy? Because because for many of us, it feels like some sort of a betrayal to the person that we love to feel joy. So I would love to hear your thoughts on, have you welcomed joy back into your life, and what does that feel like for you?
That's a great question. The joy comes in part because I've come to understand that depression and grief and all these things, and what we carry around with us in our bodies from generations past, it goes all over the place during a day for me. Especially now, I feel vulnerable to it because I'm not as busy in a rigid way as I was, or in a committed way. And I can be one way in 1 minute and change in 10 minutes. And the joy has come out when one morning I realized I really liked the taste of raisin bran. And I forgot I hadn't been eating it because I had a bout of breast cancer about 3 years ago. So I cut back on a lot of sugars, and I've been treated, and I'm feeling good about that. But I just hadn't had it, and it tasted good. Another day, I will play something, music, and all of a sudden I'm dancing through my living room, and there's nobody to see it. So I try to write about that too. But there are moments of joy, discovering where you might want to be next, finding new friends. But this stuff is not, it's going to be my companion. I don't expect the grief ever to totally leave me. I was speaking with a dear friend this morning, and I wanted to give him a big plant that I have had since 1976, a cutting from it. And I started to tell him I would give him with this big pot that Roger and I had put together and propped up literally days before he got sick, and I lost it. I remembered that I lost it. I said, this will be from us. I can talk about it now, but 6-8 hours ago, I couldn't.
And that's it's something you just, I got a couple of things I want to comment on, like food. You know, when we're grieving, sometimes we just eat to stay alive, right? Like you go through the motions. You don't want to cook. You don't really want to eat. You know, people around you make you eat, right? It's the first thing they want to do is make you eat because they are worried about you. But I love what you just said. I think it's so exquisite to think a joyful moment can be eating a spoonful of raisin bran and noticing how it tastes. Like that almost could bring me to tears, just the thought of that, because it's so small and yet it's so poignant that you're aware enough to taste food. That's like a tiny little indicator that you've made this tiny baby step, what I call rejoining the living. Because for lots, I think for so,
I love that.
because when we're in deep grief, we're not really anywhere. We're not really with the living. We're not dead. We want to be most of the time, right? But we don't want to take our life. But when we are not really amongst the living, we're not really engaged. We're lost in memory or lost in grief, or just sort of feel like we're floating untethered to this world and not quite in the next. And that, you know, I will talk to people around how do we ground ourselves in grief. I remember my grief therapist said I call it spacing out. I could stare out a window and 2 hours could pass, and I wasn't aware of time passing because I was in the past where my brother lived, you know, after my brother's death. And she would say, your brother doesn't live outside of you. He lives in your heart, and we need to bring you back into your body because grief is such it feels like you are outside. Floating is the best way. You run into walls, you trip, you fall, we hurt ourselves. We do all of these things because we're not moored, we're not tethered to anything. And so I had never thought about this until you mentioned raisin bran. And I was like, being intentional about our food is one way to ground us in the moment. Just really powerful. I just want to thank you for that.
Let's add dark chocolate to the list.
But it can be that momentary experience of the tactile and the taste of, because it brings in all of our senses when we eat.
You know, that brings something to mind is the mind's inability to grasp that this person is no longer here tasting anything with you, that he's not walking in the room. A few nights after Roger passed, his sons, a couple of them were here, and my son, and I went out of the room, and I came back and I said, I just saw Roger walk in here. You know, that's part of it. And the other part, the floating thing, I kind of felt like I was in between living and dead. I was in some kind of a bardo. I now know there are 4 of them. I think, you know, that was somewhere not grounded anyplace. And I didn't know what to do.
Right. It's a scary, it can be terrifying because if you're not there and you're not here, where are you exactly? And it's such a very lost kind of feeling. And I think something else around food, what you just said too, is it's so communal and so social. And, you know, and I just know when my husband's not home for dinner, I don't feel like cooking. I'm like, why aren't I special enough just to cook for myself? Well, because when you're cooking with us, it's intentional, right? You're making something for you to share together. And I know this is true for my friends, if your kids aren't around or whatever, that you'll eat cheese and crackers, but somehow when there are more people, you feel this need to make a meal where we sit around and we share. And when that person is gone, food or cooking it punctuates that part of being alone. It's so lonely to eat by ourselves, right? I mean, there's a loneliness about it. And that's what I mean, how pervasive grief is. It impacts everything.
Yeah.
Hearing the TV while, or going to bed and they're still downstairs watching TV, or all of those things that we take for granted around the presence of another human being sharing our space.
My situation was a bit different, and then he did all the cooking, all the domestic. So yeah, I didn't have to worry about it. He wanted to. It was something that he liked. He made it an art. So now I just kind of make something to get by,
To get by, exactly.
I'll order in, or I'll make something simple to get by. Yeah.
What do you do? Because I do know that when we can really start to break down is when we have those really quiet moments, whether you're driving in a car or after the day shuts down and you really are kind of left with yourself and you don't have the distractions of your day, of just the daily things that we do to keep our mind busy. Because it is in the quiet where we can feel the crushing weight of grief. And I would love for you to share. What do you do? Do you lean into that grief? Do you let yourself cry? And do you try to distract yourself? What have you done to help yourself during those quiet moments?
Well, I do both. I'm not avoiding the grief. And sometimes with my friend on the phone today, I said, I didn't know I was going to do this. And he said, it's all right. I have people who understand. I've had only one person to say, well, remember what good times you had. And I said, yes, but that's not my point. My point is I am in agony. I am in agony right now. So I own it and I articulate it. Sometimes I do distract myself because I like good, well-written television. So I do that, and I like to read. And those are things that I do. And I share the different things with friends. Those are things that I guess I'm amusing myself, but it's constructive, or it's not a waste. It's not just go, sit on the couch and eat potato chips or something like that.
Although there is a time and a place for that.
Or popcorn with peanut, yeah. That distracting oneself is a bad thing. I think running away from the moments is not good, but we can't sit all the time in it. It would be like I wouldn't be living. I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you if I couldn't find some ways in which I could be amused or entertained or enjoy something, a food or a friend's chat.
I think I'm going to start using the analogy, enjoying a spoonful of Raisin Bran. There's something about that I think is going to sit with me for quite some time. I think it's a metaphor for grief, of how people can slowly let little tiny moments of joy in as they're digesting, because I think that's what it is, an absorption of the depth of loss. I often say that shock is a gift to the human body when somebody dies, because I write about this, that if it were to absorb too quickly, I think that our heart would stop beating from pain.
Some days feel that it is about to. Still, I have those periods. And I thought, am I having a heart attack? My heart's okay. So I think it's important to know that those periods will come, and of course, meditation and just deep breathing helps. And sitting down, and for me, I have Kleenex boxes all over the house. Not that I use them. I'm by myself. Who cares if I'm crying down my face? But I still don't believe we should avoid them.
Well, in fact, yeah, and that's the whole point of my podcast is we've got to do our grief work. And that grief, whatever that is, whatever that looks like for human beings. And I know that sometimes there's so much fear of people that if they allow themselves to let go and cry, that they're never going to stop. And, that I offer is that's the grief work, and emotions are supposed to move, right? And so when we allow ourselves to feel the emotion, it moves it, and it moves through us rather than kind of plugging it up and swallowing back our grief or sucking it in or doing the things that we do. And I realize, I get it that when people are in a group of people that they don't necessarily want to let go and release and fall all over the place and not be able to stop it. I understand that, but it is a deep gift to ourselves as human beings and to the person that we've lost to let ourselves lean in to that pain, because that is what allows it to move.
I found that more people than I thought were tolerant, accepting, and loving about that, even if I didn't know them well. I was with a group of people last summer, and we came out of a restaurant, and I'm trying to decide whether to move to this place. And I just said, I don't know what to do. And I started crying, and two of the people there I'd never met before that night, and they were most kind. So I think at least people who have matured will, they've gone through their own, whatever the tragedies are, the losses are, understand that. But I know there are groups of people who may push back against it out of embarrassment. They don't know what to say.
Exactly. They don't know what to say. And it can be frightening to sit in someone's pain, because as human beings, we want to take away people's pain. Right. And I think, and I've said this a million times on this podcast, that really we don't have to do anything but sit in that pain, be a presence to it. We don't have to take it away. We don't have to heal it. We don't have to take it on. We don't have to do anything. We're human beings. To know my heart is to know your heart. And we're sitting there in our humanness, and that's all we have to do, right? Because part of being human is to experience what it feels like to be human. And to be human is to feel pain and joy, both.
And at some points, you think, how can I get through the next 5 minutes?
Yeah.
But you do get through it.
And how do we have compassion for our own humanness, right? Just that compassion for ourselves in those moments when someone might be there or someone's not there, is just to be with our own self in our own pain and to be gentle with ourselves.
I have a friend who said this. We have a meeting once a month on Zoom. She said, give yourself some grace. And I just said, that's the most powerful thing I've heard this week. Give yourself grace.
I talk about grace a lot too. It's grace in being in our humanness. And that's where our compassion starts with self. If we cannot have grace and compassion with ourselves, it is impossible to extend that to another human being.
That's the good thing to remember.
Mm-hmm. And to feel. I remember when I was running groups at the Center for Grieving Children, another way that we evacuate the heart is we get in our head. And the way to move emotion and to be able to process grief is to feel it. You can't think a feeling. You can only feel a feeling. And even though that might feel scary because it hurts, that is the place where some people don't like the word healing. People think we don't heal from grief. There's lots of ways people describe their journey. You move forward with your grief. You build your life around the hole in your heart, whatever works for people in the way that they describe it. But the idea is what I said earlier, is fully re-engaging at life at some point when you're ready. And if we get stuck, which we can do, and only people can determine when they feel stuck, is that sometimes we need help. We need more help, whether that's a therapist or a grief group or a church pastor or whatever works for people. When you said you've got a great group of supportive friends, but there's some place safe that we can go to help us process if we need that. Have you gone to grief groups, or have you found that you see a therapist? You said that.
Yeah, I've known him for almost 25 years. I've been thinking about it and I might ultimately, but I ended up having one of the people as dear friends who have come, called me, said, I'm thinking of you, sent me things, come over to be with me, taken me to lunch. And I try to, I'm not just taking, I try to give back, because one of the things that helps is to be helpful to other people when they've got pain. And so right now I haven't done group groups, so I have no objection. I just haven't. And COVID has, kind of kept me in the house and on the computer.
And I think that you just said something else really powerful and true. The timeline is different for all of us, but I think for those who may contemplate grief group, the one thing to think about, are you in a space to actually be present to others' pain? Because it takes everybody a different amount of time to get there. But that's an important part, because if you aren't, you're not ready for grief group. You're not ready for it. You are still deep in your own process. And though a grief group can help you continue with that processing, there's still acute grief that where you're not ready to listen to anybody else's story. Mm-hmm. You're not ready to hold anybody else's stuff because you are too in the thick of your own. And that's important too, to give yourself that grace.
That's a great observation. Another thing I would add too is that I was reminded when I did fall into tears this morning that after I finished, I felt better. I felt a relief. So that actually moves it out of your body somewhat too, the pressure that's in your body, I think.
Absolutely. I'm just noticing time, and we're going to wind down. These conversations go like this. They're so fast. But I always end with the same question. But before I ask my parting question, is there anything else that you would like to offer to listeners that I haven't asked?
I think you've asked everything, but maybe I'll reiterate that we're not alone. There's a lot out there to read and connect with to help, and don't ever feel that you are alone, so to the extent that you have no one or no reason. Because, I have said early on, I don't really want to go on. So to me, and then I look back at what you've described of my past, and I think I kind of got through a lot of stuff. So maybe I can get through a couple more decades, and be vigorous, but I will never, ever leave. You don't have to leave your loved one anywhere. You can have that loved one in your body, in your head, in your hand, if you have something to hold in your memory. So these are not things that you didn't ask, but maybe I'm just reiterating and reinforcing them.
Thank you. And I love the stones. I think anything tangible, whatever helps people in those moments where the grief just snatches their breath and they feel like they can't hang on for one more second, that can look very different for everyone. But if you can find that one thing, that spoon of raisin bran, whatever that is for you, it can get you through those desperate moments, and they don't last forever, right? Like when you get that wave of grief, deep breathe, right? Just breathe, just something very, very simple. It gets you back in your body, and it can help you to calm down.
And weep.
And weep. Yes. Okay, my parting question is, what does self-love look like for you now?
It looks like me talking to myself and saying, you learned that you don't want to go down that dark hole that you're thinking you're leading toward. You want to go here, and telling myself the opposite of what I'm feeling, like you are worthwhile. You do have family left, even if it's a small amount of family, and there is a future for you. So I think it's a self-talk. It might be something that counselors help us with. It might be, we know ourselves well enough to know when we deliberately go down a dark hole and how we can stop ourselves, at least in my case. I've done that recently. I've said, don't go there. It's not going to help. So I think for me, it's about being able to be my own best friend and to draw boundaries when I feel like I'm taxing myself too much to give. That sounds odd, but to give too much energy when I need the energy here. I need it here. I need it in my body. So I'm trying to balance it out.
That's beautiful. Yeah. And I deeply believe not a single person dies 1 second before they're supposed to. And your husband died, you didn't. Like, your soul still has more growing and learning to do in
Yes.
in the school of, in the earth school, as I like to say. Nancy, thank you so much for coming and sharing your intimate and raw journey after losing your husband. And I want to thank all of my listeners. And I hope that you got something from today's conversation that can be helpful to you or to somebody that you know is going through a difficult time. We will have links in the show notes of how to get Nancy's book. And also, are you on Instagram?
I am. I'd have to look it up and see. I don't use it very much, but I am.
Okay. Okay. Great. Well, thanks everyone. And we'll see you here next week. Have a beautiful week and we'll talk to you soon. Bye for now.